إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهديه الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Inshallah, with chapter number 20 from the book of Kitab At-Tawheed. And the chapter is a continuation after the last one, which was chapter 19, about al-ghulu, or extremism, that leads the person to worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Are you sure we took 19?
Yeah. Major cause of deviation.
باب ما جاء في التغليظ في من عبد الله.
That's 20, no? التغليظ is...
Maybe this is... الغلو في الصالحين. So according to this is 19. No. So the title of the chapter باب ما جاء من التغليظ في من عبد الله عند قبر رجل صالح فكيف إذا عبده. What's the title you have?
The condemnation of the one who worships Allah at the grave of a righteous man, and how then does this amount to worship of the man?
No. So the previous chapter was about al-ghulu fi salihin, to have extreme beliefs when it comes to the righteous men, the righteous people, because this is the roots or the root cause for the shirk, how it got established on the face of earth, as we heard. What is shirk? It's to associate partners with Allah in ibadah. When people worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in one ibadah, in more than one ibadah, and when they associate partners with Allah, there is no Rabb illallah, there is no Lord, there is no creator except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they have to associate partners with Allah with one of the creation of Allah. So the creation of Allah, for example, the human beings, most likely people, they don't worship or they don't attribute any divinity or have their hearts attached to a wicked, evil person, even though this also can happen. But the righteous ones that are more fitna to those who are inclined to religion, if it's correct to say, especially after they die. And the grave worshippers, and it's a fitna that is still existing till today, where people think that this is one of the ways to get them closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So here now, the next chapter, باب ما جاء من التغليظ. ما جاء means what came as evidences from the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام. من التغليظ. التغليظ from something when it's غليظ, when something is thick, heavy. When it comes to the non-physical meaning of it, ولو كنت فظا غليظ القلب لانفضوا من حولك, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said about the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, that if you were fadh, someone that is vulgar in his speech, in his actions, غليظ القلب, that your heart is غليظ, your heart is harsh, you have harshness in your heart towards others, لانفضوا من حولك, they would disperse from around you. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose him to be the best of all of the human beings. So at-taghlidh is when someone having this, or here the harshness, meaning the condemnation, not a light condemnation, not something simple, or don't do this, if you insist it's okay. No, at-taghlidh, that means this is such an evil thing. As we have to have this established in our hearts. According to the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, the worst evil ever committed on the face of earth is ash-shirku billah, to associate partners with Allah. And anything that leads to it is far worse than the worst major sins. So that's why when he chose the word maja'a min at-taghlidh, that how the evidences are very intense, very strong in condemnation, in what في من عبد الله عند قبر رجل صالح. This severe condemnation for someone that abad Allah, someone that worships Allah. So he's not doing shirk, he's worshipping Allah, but where? عند قبر رجل صالح, by the grave of a righteous man, worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the ibadah is to Allah. But where is he worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? By the grave of a righteous man. Then the rest of the title, فَكَيْفَ إِذَا عَبَدَ. So how is it then if he would worship this righteous man, which is far worse, of course, because that means he now is associating partners with Allah. And as we said, as a chapter would come, that how the Prophet ﷺ hama janab at-Tawheed, how this religion is so perfect that you would find in the ayat of the Quran, the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, how the Tawheed is protected. When something is very valuable, you would find many different barriers basically, that would stop the people from attacking that most valuable thing. The most valuable thing that you have, you would not leave it for anyone to come and take it and run away from it. But rather you would have it in a safe after safe and things like this. So the most important thing is the Tawheed. And the heart is the most precious thing in the life of the human being. So to protect it, to guard it. And the worst thing ever is a shirk, and that's why anything that small or big or whatever that leads to it, you would find it forbidden in the deen of Allah, forbidden for itself, and the wisdom behind it, because it leads to the shirk. Right? So it's not something that out of the ijtihad of the ulama, they see that people, when they do this, it leads them to the shirk. It's not left to the ijtihad or to the opinions of the people of knowledge, but rather Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbid it ibtida'an, meaning initially. It's forbidden because it leads to the worst thing ever, which is ash-shirku billah. So here, this is again to understand the title very well and to see how the evidence is related to this. This is about someone that worships Allah, but worships Allah by the grave of a righteous man. So how is it then, how worse that is if he would worship that person besides Allah? And then he mentioned the first hadith, and actually three hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, 4 hadith and some few words here. So he says في الصحيح عن عائشة رضي الله عنها أن أم سلمة رضي الله عنها ذكرت لرسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم كنيسة. I'm going to read first if you're having the Arabic, and then we'll hear the transition, then we go through it inshallah. أن أم سلمة ذكرت لرسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم كنيسة رأتها بأرض الحبشة وما فيها من الصور، فقال أولئك إذا مات فيهم الرجل الصالح أو العبد الصالح بنوا على قبره مسجدا وصوروا فيه تلك الصور، أولئك شرار الخلق عند الله. That's the hadith. So the translation.
In the Sahih, Aisha said, Salama mentioned to Allah's Messenger ﷺ that in Abyssinia she saw a church full of pictures and statues. He ﷺ said, when a righteous man or pious worshipper among them dies, they build a place of worship over his grave and set up all kinds of pictures and statues. They are the worst of all creatures before Allah. They combine the two evils, worshipping at the graves and making graven images and statues.
Now, this last statement is not from the hadith. The hadith, as we heard, في الصحيح, and this hadith in Sahih Imam Bukhari and others. So this is an authentic hadith. Aisha radiallahu anha, she said, أن أم سلمة, the wife of the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, ذكرت لرسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, she mentioned to the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, when they went to Al-Habasha, to Abyssinia, when they made the hijrah there, ذكرت لرسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم كنيسة رأتها بأرض الحبشة. She mentioned a kanisa. Kanisa is a church that they saw in the land of Al-Habasha, the land of Abyssinia, when they went there. وما فيها من الصور, and what's in it from الصور. And الصور is drawings, statues, all of that is included in the صور. So they draw, of course, as we know in the churches, and she mentioned that. And when someone, never seen something like this before, he might be amazed of how from an art perspective, if it's correct to say, people can see how beautiful there is. Right? It takes the eyes of how beautiful the colors and the pictures and things like this. So, of course, she was not praising it, but she just mentioned to the Prophet ﷺ these suwar, these statues and these images that were there. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said, أولئك, these people, إذا مات فيهم الرجل الصالح. If الرجل الصالح, the righteous man, مات فيهم, he died among them, أو العبد الصالح, or the righteous slave of Allah. And this is from the narrator, whether the Prophet ﷺ, he said الرجل أو العبد, because both is the same thing. A righteous man, a righteous slave of Allah, بنوا على قبره مسجدا. بنوا mean they would build. They would build على قبره, on his grave, مسجدا, a place of ibadah, a place of worship. Masjid. وصوروا فيه تلك الصور, and they would build these statues or draw these images. And then he said عليه الصلاة والسلام أولئك شرار الخلق عند الله. They are شرار الخلق. شرار from الشر, evil. They are the most evil creation by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. عند الله. So this is, see the تغليظ, see the severity of this act. Not that they're doing something evil. أولئك شرار الخلق. The worst evil of the human beings on the face of earth, those who would do this act. What is it? They would build a place of worship on top of the graves, and they would make these images and these statues. And this hadith is very important that you guys remember it, because the shubha or the doubts that some of these quburiyun, those who worship the graves and they go to the graves, they say we don't make sujood to the people in the grave. We don't make ibadah to them. Right? We're seeking their blessings or intercession, which is, of course, as mentioned before, that by itself is evil. And they would permit for people to whether build masajid on top of the graves or even permit for people to pray in the masajid that has graves. And they say what is meant by that hadith, those who would take the graves as places of sujood. Because masjidan, that means it's a place of sujood. They would take it literally as a place of sujood. But to answer this very weak argument is the hadith itself. It says, بَنَوْا عَلَى قَبْرِهِ. They would build on top of the grave masjidan. What does it mean to build on top of the grave to make sujood? No, it's to build a building, a structure. So this is masajid. These are places of worship, whether it's a church or a masjid or whatever they call it. But the thing is that they build it on top of the grave. بنوا على قبره مسجدا. And this is the masajid that is all over many of the in the Muslim world, where you have the grave of the righteous man, and then they would build a grave on top of it. And the rulings of the ulama in this is what? If people do such a thing, we have to also, I don't want to take too long because of the time, but this is a very serious matter, because sometimes people, they have these false evidences of things. They say, if people would do something like this and it's widespread, that means it's okay. I have no idea how they would link these two things together. Or if many of the people are upon this, you're saying they're all wrong. What is that to do with the truth and falsehood? It doesn't matter. وَإِن تُطِعْ أَكْثَرَ مَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ يُضِلُّوكَ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. If you obey most of the people on the face of the earth, they would lead you astray. We have nusus, we have text, we have wahi from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, understood by the best generation of Islam. We need to follow that. So these people, they would build a masjid on top of it. The ulama, they say that if that happens, what's the ruling of that masjid? Is to demolish the masjid. Of course, by the people of authority. Not to take the grave out, but rather to demolish the masjid, because the masjid was built on top of the grave. And some of them, if you look into the books of fiqh, regardless whether this is the most authentic opinions or not, they make that distinction between a masjid built on top of the grave versus that the masjid is there already and they would make a grave enter into the masjid. Right? So there's two types of masajid when it comes to the graves. Some of the masajid, the grave is there first and they build on top of it a masjid. The ruling of it is remove the masjid because the grave is first. But if the masjid is already there and a righteous man died and he made in his wasiyah for him to be buried in his masjid that he built, and it happens in some parts of the world. So they bring his grave and they make it, or they bring the body and they bury that person in the masjid. So what is the ruling then? If people would have the authority to do something, is to remove the grave to make him buried into the Muslim graveyard. You understand the difference? Because here بنوا على قبره مسجدا, and these are the worst evil, as the Prophet ﷺ he said, which shows clearly that it's haram to build masajid on top of the qubur, on top of the graves. And then after that, he mentioned after the hadith, فهؤلاء جمعوا بين الفتنتين. These people, they brought together the two fitnas, the two evil actions, which is trials for others. فتنة القبور وفتنة التماثيل. The fitna of al-qubur, the qubur, the graves, is a test for people. Why? Because either people will make ta'zeem to it and exalt it and worship these people besides Allah, or they, for example, abuse the qubur of the Muslimin, in which people should go to the graveyards, as we mentioned before, for two reasons. What are the two reasons why would a person go to the graves of the Muslims? One is to remember death, so it's for one's benefit, as the Prophet ﷺ said, فَإِنَّا تُذَكِّرُكُمُ الْآخِرَةِ. It reminds you of the hereafter. The second reason, dua to Allah for who? For the dead. So for you to be ameen to benefit the dead, not for you to benefit from them, but for them to benefit from your presence by making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah forgive them, that Allah bless them, as the Prophet ﷺ would do when he would go to the Baqi', visiting the graves of the believers. So these evil ones, they had the two fitna, the fitna of al-qubur and the fitna of the tamathil. Tamathil, the statues, the images, this is all forbidden. Whether people would worship or not worship, it's forbidden in the deen of Islam. Anything that has a soul, human beings, animals, and so on. And as the Prophet ﷺ said, as-surah al-ra's. As-surah is the head. So if there's no head, then there's no surah, there's no image. So, and not the face, as some people think, it's the head. Some people make a circle for the face, and then the rest of the body is there, and they think that this is not a surah. No, it's a surah. It has to be without a head completely, if it's to be valid, to be there. Then he says, وَلَهُمَا عَنْهَا, and also, meaning لَهُمَا, this is مُثَنَّى for the dual tense. That means for Al-Bukhari and Muslim. This hadith is in Al-Bukhari and Muslim. عنها قالت, عنها meaning referring to Aisha رضي الله عنها. She said, لما نزل برسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم طفق يطرح خميصة له على وجهه فإذا اغتم بها كشفها فقال وهو كذلك لعنة الله على اليهود والنصارى اتخذوا قبور أنبيائهم مساجد يحذر ما صنعوا ولولا ذلك أبرز قبره غير أنه خشى أن يتخذ مسجدا أخرجه. So the translation of the hadith.
Also in Bukhari and Muslim, Aisha radiallahu anha narrated, when the death approached Allah's Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he began to draw a piece of cloth, bedsheet, over his face, sometimes covering and sometimes removing because of distress. He ﷺ said in this state, Allah's curse be upon the Jews and the Christians for taking the graves of their prophets as places of worship. Thus he ﷺ warned the people about their actions. Had there not been any fear of making the Prophet's grave a place of worship, his ﷺ grave would have been as open as the graves of his companions.
So the second hadith in Bukhari and Muslim, authentic hadith, says, if you see, لما نزل برسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. نزل from نزل. نزل means when something comes down. So نزل in the passive tense, when something came down upon the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام. So this refers to death. When death came down upon the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, that means the angel of death came to the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام. طفق يطرح خميصة له على وجهه. طفق, that means he kept on. He kept on. يطرح, الطرح is when you throw something. So he kept on putting something, خميصة. الخميصة is a piece of cloth that has lines to it. So describing just the piece of cloth, he kept on putting this خميصة on his face عليه الصلاة والسلام على وجهه. فإذا اغتم بها كشفها. And once it bothers him, he would remove it. كشفها, he would show his face. فقال وهو كذلك. So he said عليه الصلاة والسلام when he was like that, meaning without the خميصة covering his face, He says, this is in the last moments of the Prophet ﷺ in this life, he said in this narration, لعنة الله على اليهود والنصارى. There's some narration says, لعن الله اليهود والنصارى. لعن Allah means may Allah curse. But here, la'natullah, that means the curse of Allah is upon. So, making it as a fact. He's not making dua, he's saying this as a fact, that the curse of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the curse from Allah, that means they kicked out of the mercy of Allah, على اليهود والنصارى, the Jews and the Christians. Why? اتخذوا قبور أنبيائهم مساجد. They took, اتخذوا, they're the ones that took the graves of their prophets, masajid, places of worship. يحذر ما صنعوا. The way the Prophet ﷺ said it is warning against what they did. He's saying that ﷺ warning the ummah not to fall into this evil action that the Jews and the Christians before did, when they attributed to the prophets of Allah what's supposed to be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. So they worshipped their prophets besides Allah. And how did that happen? Is when they would take it as a place of worship. The graves of the prophets, they took it as a place of worship, meaning on top of their graves. And of course, if there is any body that is blessed, is the bodies of the messengers of Allah, of course. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered the believers to follow them, not to worship them besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, يحذر ما صنع, warning against what they did so that they don't do the same thing with the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. He says, وَلَوْلَا ذَلِكَ, if it wasn't that the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam said that, because he said that, أُبْرِزَ قَبْرُ, they would have made the qabr, the grave of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, apparent, very clear, so that people would, visit more and things like this. So because of that, they did not do that to the qabr, to the grave of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, and meaning that they would have taken the Prophet ﷺ to be buried in Al-Baqi' for people to see it. But then there's another hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, he said that the prophets, whenever they die, it's for them to be buried in the same spot that they died. So that's why the Prophet ﷺ was buried there. But وَلَوْلَا ذَلِكَ أُبْرِزَ قَبْرُ, they would have made the qabr of the Prophet ﷺ apparent and clear in front of everyone. غَيْرَ أَنَّهُ, but because of, other than, here khashiyah, either khashiyah or khushiyah. Both vowels are correct. Khashiyah, referring to the Prophet ﷺ, that he feared ﷺ, and yuttakhadha masjidan, that people would take his grave as a masjid, as a place of worship. And khushiyah, in the passive tense, that it's feared that the Prophet ﷺ's grave will be taken as a masjid. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ, he's not buried in the masjid. Right? He's buried in his house, ﷺ, where he died, ﷺ. Yes, you might see it from outside that this is the masjid, but the Prophet ﷺ is not buried in the masjid, he's buried in his house. And this is another shubha. This is another argument that some people, they say, well, what about the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ? That means to approve the fact that you can build masajid on top of the graves. First of all, the Prophet ﷺ is not buried in the masjid, he's buried in his house. Second of all, did that happen at the time of the Prophet ﷺ? The expansion of the masjid? The answer is no. Did it happen in the time of the Khulafa al-Rashidin? The answer is no. So to start with, this is not an evidence of anything. Where do we take the evidence of the deen of Allah? From the Quran, the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and the rightly guided Khalifa Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Ali. عليكم بسنتي وسنة الخلفاء الراشدين المهديين من بعدي. Right? So this is the statement of the Prophet ﷺ. So it's not even an argument to start with. So this is something that Allah decreed. This is the qadr of Allah. That this is the case now. That the expansion of the masjid in such a way, but it's not based on a matter of sharia that they did that. This is a reality that it's present. So therefore, this is not an evidence as an argument for such a thing. The other thing is that, again, as the Prophet ﷺ is not buried in the masjid, plus also the way that the grave of the Prophet ﷺ is in such a way, nobody can face the grave of the Prophet ﷺ or to take it as a masjid in any way or form by the protection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is a way even to protect it from even what can be even worse if people would come and visit the grave in such a way that they would worship it besides Allah if it's apparent or it's there for people to see. So this is the second hadith. The third hadith ولمسلم عن جندب ابن عبد الله قال سمعت النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قبل أن يموت بخمس وهو يقول إني أبرأ إلى الله أن يكون لي منكم خليل فإن الله قد اتخذني خليلا كما اتخذ إبراهيم خليلا ولو كنت متخذا من أمتي خليلا لاتخذت أبا بكر خليلا ألا وإن من كان قبلكم كانوا يتخذون قبور أنبيائهم مساجد ألا فلا تتخذوا القبور مساجد فإني أنهاكم عن ذلك. So this is the translation, inshallah.
Muslim reported from Jundub bin Abdullah, who narrated, I heard the Prophet ﷺ say, only 5 days before his death, I am free and clear towards Allah of having any of you as my Khalil. Verily, Allah has taken me as His Khalil, just as He had taken Ibrahim as a Khalil. If I would have taken anyone from my Ummah as a Khalil, I would have taken Abu Bakr as a Khalil. Beware, those who preceded before you used to make their prophets' graves into places of worship. Beware, don't take any graves as a place of worship. I forbid you to do so.
That's good, inshallah. So this hadith, Jundub ibn Abdullah radiallahu anhu, he said that the Prophet ﷺ said this 5 days before he died. ﷺ. And usually the last words of someone in his life is one of the most important ones. Giving the wasiyah, what's the most important thing for people to hold fast to, especially if it's the Prophet ﷺ. So he said ﷺ, Inni abra'u ilallah. Abra, like Surah Bara'a, that means I distant myself, I disloyal myself. I have nothing to do with this action if it happened. So make it very clear. أن يكون لي منكم خليل. That I have from any of you Khalil. And Khalil is the closest level of love. You know, there is levels of love. Al-Mahabba, this is the very common one. Al-Khilla is a level higher than Al-Mahabba. So when you use the word the love of Allah, you love someone for the sake of Allah. This word love, if it's correct to translate it as Al-Mahabba, there's a level higher than that, which is called Al-Khulla. This is where Al-Khalil comes from. So this is higher than just the normal love. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said, I distance myself from that I would have any Khalil from you. فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ قَدِ اتَّخَذَنِي خَلِيلًا. Because indeed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took me as a Khalil, the closest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, كَمَا اتَّخَذَ إِبْرَاهِيمَ خَلِيلًا. The same way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took Ibrahim as Khalil, as it's mentioned in the Quran. And it goes, sometimes it's good to know the linguistics of things, not that this is how it's explained only linguistically, but it gives an idea, is when you have a very tiny road that only fits one person, right, that can walk on it. You know, al-khilla it's a you know, not like a ditch or something in the road where only one can walk. So if two people are walking there, you would find them attached to each other. So this comes from the closeness that no such a closeness can be closer than this, right? So again, this is a high level, and that's what the Prophet ﷺ is in this level. And some people, as Ibn Qayyim had mentioned, and it's mentioned in the Sharh, that many times or oftentimes people would say that Ibrahim alayhi salam is Khalilullah and the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam is Habibullah. They think that this is more than that. This is wrong. The Prophet ﷺ is Khalilullah, as the hadith says, because Al-Khilla is higher than even the normal Mahabba, which is the love of Allah. And then he says, وَلَوْ كُنْتُ مُتَّخِذًا مِنْ أُمَّتِي خَلِيلًا. If I would have taken from my ummah a Khalil, this high level of love that he would take from any of the human beings, لَاتَّخَذْتُ أَبَا بَكْرٍ خَلِيلًا. I would have taken Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu as my Khalil, which shows, of course, the level of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. He is the best of all of the ummah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And subhanAllah, when even it's mentioned in the Sharh, those who hate Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, like the Rafidah, they are the worst when it comes to the shirk billah. they associate partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala day and night, attributing to Ali radiallahu anhu or to other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, worshipping them besides Allah. So you see how as a punishment from Allah, if someone would do such an evil action, they can be punished by Allah in such a way. So if the one that's supposed to be loved the most among the ummah after the Prophet ﷺ, some people they would hate him the most. That means you can imagine the corrupted heart. Someone that's supposed to be loved the most. If it's a normal human beings, maybe there's something there. But someone that you're supposed to love him the most among all of the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ, some people they would hate him the most. As a punishment of that, their hate is not a normal hate. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala corrupts their heart, make them when they hate something is not a normal hate and love. Becomes corrupted in the subject of love and hate. So they would love beyond what's supposed to be loved, and they would make shirk and associate partners with Allah, and their hatred becomes an extreme hatred. It is not a normal thing, and that's why even they say, if you have an enemy, it's one of the favors of Allah that your enemy is moderate in their hate and love, right? They're wise, so that they don't act in a foolish way. So anyway, this is Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. Then he says, "Ala wa inna man kana qablakum." The Prophet ﷺ said, "Ala." This is to pay attention. Indeed, those who were before you, كانوا يتخذون قبور أنبيائهم مساجد. They used to take the graves of their prophets as masajid, as places of worship. ألا فلا تتخذوا القبور مساجد. Clearly, indeed, do not take the graves as masajid, as places of worship. فإني أنهاكم عن ذلك. Because indeed I forbade you from this. So the words cannot be clearer than this, showing how evil it was for the nations before, and warning the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ, do not take the graves as masajid, as build masajid, as places of worship. So whether it's to build a masjid on it, as it's mentioned in the previous narration, or to go to the graveyard to make ibadah in the graveyard. This is not permissible by the clear statement of the Prophet ﷺ. ألا فلا تتخذوا القبور مساجد فإني أنهاكم عن ذلك. And the Prophet ﷺ forbade it clearly. So therefore, even the salah, is it permissible for a Muslim to go to the graveyard in Baqiyah, right next to the Masjid of the Prophet ﷺ, and have thousands of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum buried there? Is it permissible to enter the Baqiyah, the graveyard, and to make Salatul Dhuhr there? Is it permissible? It's not permissible. Why? Because it's a graveyard. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, لا تجعلوا بيوتكم قبورا صلوا في بيوتكم لا تتخذوا قبوركم بيوتا لا تتخذوا بيوتكم قبورا. Do not take your houses لا تجعلوا بيوتكم قبورا. Do not make your homes as graveyards. Pray in your home. Make some salah in your home. Do not make it like the graveyard, because the graveyard is not permissible for a person to make salah there. Only Salatul Janazah. If a person misses Salatul Janazah, they can pray Salatul Janazah by the grave facing the Qibla. No sujood, no ruku'. You're making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Allah forgive the deceased. So whether it's nafli salah, farda salah in the graveyard is forbidden. And what's the difference between the graveyard for someone to make salah there, which is forbidden, versus praying in a masjid that is built on a grave? It's the same thing. It's forbidden also. And the Masjid of the Prophet ﷺ is an exception, as we heard before, plus there's virtue in praying in it. Any other place on the face of earth, there is no virtue in praying in it. Then he says, فَقَدْ نَهَى عَنْهُ آخِرَ حَيَاتِهِ. The Prophet ﷺ naha, forbade from making ibadah and salah by the graves and to make it as a places of worship. آخِرَ حَيَاتِهِ. Why did he say at the end of his life? Why this is significant? Because when it comes to an-nasikh wal-mansukh, so that nobody will come and say maybe this was abrogated by some other hadith or something. Because you know that if they used to like so much the hadith of, for example, Abdullah al-Bajali radiallahu anhu, because he was one of the last, and the same thing, Jarir ibn Abdullah, he used to be, because his Islam was late. He became a Muslim late. So whatever hadith he narrates, it clearly states that this is towards the end of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, so it's not been changed. So they used to like his hadiths. Why? Because this is the last that the Prophet ﷺ was upon. So no one is to come and to say maybe this was earlier, out of the fear that people might fall into shirk, but now after the Islam was established, there is no fear for them, as some people they argue. ثم إنه لعن وهو في السياق. Then the Prophet ﷺ cursed while he is in السياق. السياق is سياق الموت, meaning by the moment of death. من فعله, from these actions. والصلاة عندها, and to pray by the graves, forbade that. ألا وإني أنهاكم عن ذلك. Not just building, but also praying and worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by the graves. وإن لم يبنى مسجد, even if the masjid is not built. وهو معنى قولها خشى أو خشي أن يتخذ أو أن يتخذ مسجدا, that he feared or they feared that it will be taken as a masjid. Then he says فإن الصحابة, the last part of the chapter, he says فإن الصحابة, indeed the Sahaba, لم يكونوا ليبنوا حول قبره مسجدا. لم يكونوا, there is no way that the Sahaba would ever build around the grave of the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام a masjid. وكل موضع قصدت الصلاة فيه فقد اتخذ مسجدا. Can you read the translation?
Ahmed has reported with a good sanad.
Before that, فإن الصحابة, right after the previous hadith.
The most evil of men?
Indeed the Sahaba, something about the Sahaba.
The companions never built any place of worship around his grave. Any place which is intended for prayer or where prayer is performed has indeed been taken as a masjid. Just as the Prophet ﷺ said, the whole earth has been made for me a masjid, and it is pure and clean.
And Wali Ahmed?
Ahmed has reported with a good sanad that Ibn Mas'ud narrated in a marfu' hadith, tradition traced to the Prophet ﷺ, the most evil men are those upon whom the signs of our resurrection comes while they are still alive, and those who take graves as places of worship.
No. So as we heard his words here, that the Sahaba never built a masjid on top of the grave of the Prophet ﷺ, or on top of any masjid. And any place يصلى فيه, any place that you pray on, is called masjid, because this is a place of salah. As the Prophet ﷺ, he said, جُعِلَتْ لِيَ الْأَرْضُ مَسْجِدًا وَطَهُورًا. The earth has been made for me a masjid, meaning a place of worship, place of salah, and tahura, a means of purification. If there's no water, you make tayammum with the earth. And the continuation of the hadith, so أَيُّمَا أَحَدُكُمْ حَضَرَتْهُ الصَّلَاةِ, any one of you that the salah time comes and there's no masjid, he makes salah in whatever place he's in. And if there's no water, he makes tayammum if there's no water to make wudu. So he says وَلِأَحْمَدْ بِسَنَةٍ جَيِّد. So what he meant by this is both are forbidden, to build a masjid on top of a grave and to pray in it, or to build or to make a salah by the graves, because the earth also is made as a masjid. And to remember that word banawu, right? So that it's not just about the graveyards, but also having the masajid built on the graves. And then the last hadith by Imam Ahmad rahimahullah, with a sound narration, Ali ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu marfu'an, that means he attributed that to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasallam. He's the one that said it. Inna min shirar nas, indeed from shirar nas, again the worst of the people, the most evil among the people, man tudrikuhum as-sa'a, the ones that the hour, the hour, the day of judgment, tudrikuhum, that means they are alive when the hour is established on them. وهم أحياء, the hour will be established on the worst people on the face of earth. As the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, after all of the major signs and Isa alayhi and killing the Dajjal and all of this and living on the earth as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will for him to live, after all of that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will send a light wind that would take the souls of the believers, and they would only feel from it like a pinch under their arms, take their souls in ease. And then those who will be living, and the iman before that will decrease from one generation to the other till the worst people ever will be on the face of earth, and upon them the hour will be established, to the extent of which no one would say Allah, Allah, and on them the day of judgment will occur. This is the first part of the hadith. وَالَّذِينَ يَتَّخِذُونَ الْقُبُورَ مَسَاجِدَ. So who else, who are other than them, are the worst of the people in evil? Those who take the qubur, the graves, as masajid, as places of worship. And subhanAllah, how they're both mentioned in the same context. And how people would take this issue of al-qubur lightly. And they call those who would forbid anything or any form of ibadah and dhikr and so on in the graveyards, they would call them whatever, Wahhabis, extremists, whatever there is. When you see that hadith, is not just simple matters and how they are linked with this worst ever on the face of earth, those who the hour will occur while they are alive. وَالَّذِينَ يَتَّخِذُونَ الْقُبُورَ مَسَاجِدَ. Those who would take the qubur as places of worship. So to stay away from making ibadah by the graves, let alone to worship وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ those who are in the grave or the human beings, to show how then the title of the chapter is what? مَا جَاءَ مِنَ التَّغْلِيظ. How severe, how strong the condemnation. And the masail, or what's mentioned afterwards, which is as we heard in the hadith, the first one, I would say briefly because of the time of the salah, what the Prophet ﷺ, he said about the one that would build a masjid, worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in it, but it's by the grave of a righteous man, even if the niyyah of the doer is a good intention. It doesn't matter. His good intentions does not benefit him because he did something that is forbidden. When something is forbidden, take this as a rule. If something is forbidden, it does not become a good deed as a result of a good intention. Right? So if someone knows that drinking wine is haram, can he say I'm drinking it with good intentions? As long as my heart is sincere, what does that benefit you? You're committing haram. So the same thing, worshipping Allah by the grave of a righteous man, and this is haram, it does not change by good intentions. So we're not talking about intentions of people. This is regardless whether intention or good or bad. It does not even exist to say someone has a good intention when they do an evil action. They don't go together. These are two opposites. Unless a person is ignorant about the ruling of something, then it's a different situation. Number one. Number two, النهي عن التماثيل. Forbidding التماثيل, statues and images. وغلظ الأمر في ذلك. That the matter is heavy. It's not a simple matter. Don't think, oh, now humanity is this and that. Who would worship images? They worship worse than images. So don't think good about the human beings that they would stay away from this. And what's sufficient for us is the text. If it's forbidden, something is forbidden, that's it. We see سمعنا وأطعنا, we listen and we obey. Number three, العبرة. What matters is in في مبالغته صلى الله عليه وسلم في ذلك. المبالغة is to go extra step, is to be extreme. But what is meant here, how the Prophet ﷺ forbade what we heard, he did not use simple words. Did not use, you can forbid different things different ways, right? So if it's something not that of a major evil, you would use different words than if it's something that is such a great evil thing. We do that with our children. If your child walks into you with a gun in his hand, for example, how would you react? Versus that if he walks in with candy that you told him don't eat candy at this time of the day. Right? How would you react? Differently. So the same thing, how the Prophet ﷺ, how the words that he chose and he said when it comes to the subject of the grave worshipping and so on. كيف بين لهم هذا أولا ثم قبل موتي بخمس. He made it very clear to them, and before he died he said it again. And the last moments, the last words of the Prophet ﷺ, and it was not sufficient that he already told them there before. He repeated it ﷺ before he died. Also, what the Prophet ﷺ forbade, that from people would do it by his grave. Before the grave even comes, before he died ﷺ, he forbade them from doing these actions by the grave of the Prophet ﷺ. Number 5, that this is from the ways, from the sunan of the Jews and the Christians by the graves of the prophets. The fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cursed them because of that. And the Prophet ﷺ intended by this to warn us as his ummah from this. And the reason why they did not raise the grave of the Prophet ﷺ, and the meaning of took it as masjid. So what is the meaning of took it as masjid? To build a masjid or to make it a place of worship? Both. Number 10, أنه قرن بين من اتخذها, that how the Prophet ﷺ mentioned both in the same context. Those who would take these graves, build or make these graves as places of worship, and those who the hour will be established on them, which they are the worst people ever. So, and he mentioned, this is something that we didn't say, فذكر الذريعة إلى الشرك قبل وقوعه مع خاتمته. He mentioned the dhari'ah. Dhari'ah is what leads to. He mentioned what leads to the shirk, to the associating partners with Allah before it happens, and then it shows the end of it. It has to go this way. And shaitan, as we said, he has his ways. That's why it starts with something small, good intentions and things like this. And that's why if people sometimes they see why the ulama are very strict in this matter, because they know what it leads to. Not that they know the unseen, billah, because they know the nusus talks about this. And even worse, if people do not talk about the Tawheed, then what's going to happen if they don't talk about it and they don't warn against shirk? Then this is something that would lead the people to fall into the shirk. And then you see that again the sad reality of many, the subject of a shirk and the tawheed and stuff like that, it's something that is not the most important talks in deen and masajid and so on. It's all about good manners and softening the hearts and being kind, and this is part of the deen. This is an essential part of the deen. But where's the foundation of the deen? And that's why books like the Kitab At-Tawheed doesn't have to be the Kitab with that same author. You know, it's just the ayat and the hadith, something that should be once you start it, you finish it, you start it again, and you finish it, and this is the subject all the time. And if you think that this is a strange thing, read the Quran. From the beginning to the Quran, if you read it in Ramadan, what's the subject that sticks into your mind, into your heart when you read the Quran? Tawheed versus shirk. And then the implications of that. So it shows the importance of it to make the person ala bayyinah, on clear evidences and proofs that this is the right way, this is the upright way of following the deen of Allah. Again, in the khutbah of the Prophet ﷺ, before he died, warning against these two groups, which is the worst of the people of al-bid'ah, and some even of the people of knowledge, they do not even include them in the 72 groups, which is al-Rafida wal-Jahmiyyah. Al-Rafida, those who curse the Sahaba radiallahu anhum and so on, and they commit these matters of shirk. And the Jahmiyyah, those who deny the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala completely. They're kuffar because they say, you say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Sami', they say no, He's not Sami', like this. Not making ta'wil, no, they deny it completely. وَبِسَبَبِ Rafida, because of them, who is the one? Historical wise, who's the one that initiated worshipping the graves in this ummah? Al-Rafida. They are the ones that introduced the grave worshipping in the ummah. وهم أول من بنى عليها المساجد. And you see the masajid in the Muslim world, it's when the Fatimis took over. And the Fatimis, they were not Muslims to start with. And they're from the extreme of the Rafida. Right? And they build these masajid on top of the graves, and till now it's present. So they're the ones that initiated it. ما بلي به رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من شدة النزع. The Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, سكرات الموت, or the last moments, was tough for the messengers, for the prophets of Allah, because the reward is multiplied. ما أكرم به من الخلة, what the Prophet ﷺ has been honored by the khillah, by this highest level, the closest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the fact that this is higher than al-mahabba, higher than the love. التصريح بأن الصديق أفضل الصحابة clearly stated that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu as-Siddiq is the best of all of the companions radiallahu anhu. Al-Ishara ila khilafati, also pointing to that his khilafah, because he's the best of the ummah, so he's the one that is going to be or succeed after the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So these are briefly some of the benefits mentioned there, and the importance of the hadith and the ayat, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us benefit from what we heard and to protect our hearts from anything means of deviations. والعياذ بالله. صلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وصحبه وسلم. سبحانك اللهم ربنا بحمدك اشهد ان لا اله الا انت استغفرك.